Where does creativity fit into compliance? In more places than you think. Problem solving, accountability, communication, and connection, they all take creativity. Join your hosts, Tom Fox and Ronnie Feldman, on Creativity and Compliance, part of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox and Ronnie Feldman back for another episode. And today you are in for a real treat because we have special guest Ricardo Pellafone. He is the founder of Broadcat, a creative agency that develops simple, task-based, creative designed compliance checklists and graphical content. Ricardo is quite outspoken about why he thinks compliance training sucks, but he has some ideas how to make it not suck. So we're going to explore that. We're going to explore Broadcat. He's got a really unique background in compliance that brought him up to where he is. And of course, we have Mr. Shy Cub himself, Ronnie Feldman. So Ronnie.
Yeah, that's right.
What do you got to say for us?
What do I get to say? Shy Cub. Well, I do miss the Cubs. I'll tell you that. Hey, we're excited to have Ricardo on. He's someone that we chat all the time at the conferences, and so anyway, excited to have you on, Ricardo.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So, Ricardo, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about your professional background, because I think it's a really unique journey that's brought you to Broadcat or found Broadcat.
Yeah, sure thing. So I started my career out as a litigator. So I was at like a boutique, and then I was at a big international firm. And I started off doing like shareholder litigation defense. So like when boards are sued by their shareholders for compliance issues, we would be retained to be their investigations counsel. From there, I went in-house. So I was an in-house compliance lawyer at a Fortune 500 in California, and then at a sovereign wealth group in the Middle East. So I was in Abu Dhabi for a couple of years. And there I was running investigations as well. And so what led me to Broadcat was, so I don't come to training and communications from that background. I come from the investigation side of the house. And that's really what led me to it. So I started Broadcat about 4 years ago. And a lot of the driver for that is just seeing that like a lot of the stuff that was being done in training and communications just lived in like this like totally parallel universe from the type of stuff that actually causes investigations. And so that is the problem that we try and solve, is really framing things around, this is the type of stuff that gets you in trouble. This is what you should be training on.
So, Ronnie, I'm going to play the straight man in this trio, so I'm going to pitch it over to you.
Sure. Well, just by way of introduction, I remember learning about Broadcat about 4 years ago. It's about the time when I started learnings and entertainments, and I started seeing this other creative agency popping up called Broadcat. I'm like, what's these guys all about? And then I found that we were talking a lot of similar language and hitting on a lot of the same themes, which is that the way traditional compliance training is conducted is just terrible, and it tends to be terrible for lots of different reasons that I hope to talk about today. So I thought maybe this is a good place to start. So why don't we start with question number one, from your perspective, Ricardo? Why is compliance training the worst?
Yeah. So there's like a million different ways to answer that, and I think a lot of times we talk about things that are true but kind of surface level. So people critique that it's like cheesy or it's too long. All of that is like absolutely dead on true. But I think there's this really foundational issue where I think a lot of the times when you see why compliance training is really bad, it's because the people who are making it or deploying it are not really clear on what compliance training is supposed to do. And so they try and make it do too much. And then they get upset that it doesn't work. But of course it doesn't work if you're trying to use it for the wrong purpose. So let me just maybe give a definition for what compliance training is. There's 4 parts to it. So it's number 1, compliance training is a tool. Number 2, it's a tool that you use to drive behavior. Number 3, it's a tool used to drive behavior of willing people. And number 4, tool you use to drive behavior of willing people by helping them make decisions. So to unpack that a little bit, when I say it's a tool, I mean that compliance training it's like not valuable in itself. It is valuable because it does something else. So it's valuable because it gets a result versus just being valuable for the sake of doing it. That's the first piece of it. So the second piece is that the result you get is changed behavior. So the purpose of compliance training is to get people to do something different. And that is what distinguishes it from like compliance education. Three, the audience for compliance training is willing people. So like people who want to do the right thing, because you can always ignore training, like always. Like I know Tom is also sitting in Texas. Tom, you're also an attorney like me. Anyone who sits in Texas as an attorney has to do, well, my license, I deactivated my license so I don't have to do this anymore, but otherwise 15 hours of continuing legal education every year. And what you've learned pretty quickly is that they'll try and do things to make sure that you are watching the continuing legal education things online, like pop a little code up or they get to click on something every couple minutes. And like it takes like 2 seconds to figure out that you can just also look at your phone or have something in another window. So when you talk about things like training, it's for people who want to learn. You can always find a way to ignore it. And like, that's okay. I think a lot of people have a lot of angst about that fact, but what they're doing is like forgetting that training is one part of a compliance program. So like training and comms is one part. You also have auditing and monitoring and investigations and discipline. Those are for your people who don't care about doing the right thing. You don't have to try and force them to learn stuff. They're never going to. You can't make people learn anything. So it's for people who want to learn. That's where a lot of it goes. Training goes wrong, especially online training. And then finally, it's for helping people make decisions. And this is what distinguishes it from a control. So you use training when you need to have a human being decide to do something. So you can't fully systematize or standardize it. You have to have like a human body decide to do something. That's what you do training for. If it's something you can fully systematize, like a lot of times people use training as a control, it's not a control. And if you try and make it a control, you're going to be frustrated. So that's the definition for it. I think big picture, I think the root cause of why a lot of it's so bad is because people try and use it for the wrong purpose. You see this especially in annual training, where it's like people are doing it just for the sake of saying they did annual training. The content's about abstract concepts instead of like the behaviors you want people to do. There's always mechanics put in that are exclusively there so people don't click through too quick. But again, you can't make people learn. So all it does is annoy the people who do want to learn. And then it covers stuff that should be a control. So like I believe very strongly that training is a powerful tool, but I also believe like a jackhammer is a powerful tool. It doesn't mean you use it to solve every problem. So ultimately, when you see why so many people, compliance people as well as business people, hate compliance training, it's because it's not the right tool for what's trying to be done. And people are using it for the wrong purpose. You have to use the right tool for the job.
I want to pick up on that, but just to talk a little bit about some of these aspects of training for a second. So it's like, just to restate, you got these people who are using compliance training, but they're treating it like education. They're trying to teach you to be
a compliance officer.
Compliance officers. Yeah. Versus teaching you what to do when a certain situation comes up. So that's super interesting. And then the other thing I find interesting is that I feel like they'll take like a bad training video but then they'll throw money at it and they'll put all these bells and whistles in it, but it's still a bad training video because it's not made with the end user in mind. Does that sound fair?
Yeah. So both those things get to, I think, prioritizing the wrong thing. And so I think with the first point you made is that's content, right? So when you talk about the content, it's what the end user, what the employee needs, not what you know as the compliance person. Mm-hmm. And so by default, both for stuff you can buy off the shelf as well as stuff that you do in-house. I was 100% guilty of this when I was in-house. That it's just easy to try and make people like you, because you can do everything from your perspective and just say, here's everything I know, you should know it too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But the problem is like it's super hard for the people who are listening to it. So that's the first piece. The second piece you're talking about is where I think people prioritize format or media over problem. And so it's like you start with like, what do you want people to do? And then from there you figure out what the right tool is to use. So if you're listening to this and you're like, wow, I should really have some like infographics or a compliance training video, like stop. Like you don't know that yet. Think about what do you want? Who are you trying to reach? What do you want them to do? And then once you answer those questions, the format is a lot more obvious. But if you start thinking that hey, I have to have this be an interactive animated video, like that, for some cases you should. But like, if you start from that, you're going to just be looking for a problem. So you start with like, what is the business problem you're trying to solve? And then you back into, and then finally the format, the tool you use is the last thing you decide. So I think that's where you see people, they have a bad training video, they make it a more expensive training video, but it shouldn't have been a training video in the first place. And like, that's the problem, is like, we have to start with what is the business problem we are trying to solve. That's where training is very meaningful, is where it's solving a specific problem versus just throwing media at people.
I relate to this quite a bit because even before I got in the compliance space, we were creating comedic content for all sorts of different business problems, and people would come, hey, we want a viral video, or hey, we really into animation, or we're really into live action, or we really want it scenario based. And they come with all these things, and we let them talk, and then you always say, great, what is it that we're trying to solve? What is it we're trying to do? Because form should follow function. So it totally makes sense. Like, and as you say, like, the ideas will present themselves when you figure out what is it that we're trying to do.
Yeah, so it's strategy versus tactics. So strategy is like, what are you trying to do? Then the tactic is the format you use. And like, look, everyone falls prey to this. I fall prey to this when we're looking at like sales and marketing strategies or tactics. And it's like, oh, I see people doing this, we should go do this. And it's like, well, what are you really trying to do? And then finding the tool to use that is a lot easier. But the problem is that like, we all see tools and shiny things in the marketplace all the time. We all want to go after. So like, no matter, it's not unique to compliance. It's just a very human thing that you have to force yourself to slow down and think about, what am I really trying to do? How will I know if it worked? And then picking the tool is like super easy after that, because you know exactly what you're trying to accomplish. That is difficult to do, but that is exactly how your business people operate. Like, your business will not stay in business if your business people aren't thinking that way.
I have another question, but Tom, just checking in. Did you have any? Do you want to chime in at this point, or should I plow forward?
So yeah, could you define, Ricardo, or maybe give a little more color around the differences between compliance training and compliance education?
Yeah, absolutely. I can give you like some characteristics and then an analogy that will probably clarify it more. So education is when you need someone to have a really flexible understanding. It's really about concepts and frameworks, because that person, it's a part of their core job duty, and they need to apply it in a whole lot of different circumstances. So compliance education is what compliance professionals need and what a couple control people need. So maybe some people on your auditing team. Most of what you see in the market and most of what people do in-house falls in this bucket. And that is because of what I just said, that it's very easy for us to create education because it's natural. It's just explaining what we know from our perspective. But it's also really hard for learners. So that's education. Training is when you say, I need people to do these specific things. It's not part of their core job duty. You just need them to know how it applies to them so they can do their job the right way. That's what most employees actually need day to day. Seriously, now the analogy here is taxes. So if you think about how you interact with like the tax code, like we all have to pay taxes, right? So I have a tax accountant, and he needs to have tax education. Like his job is describing how taxes apply to all of his clients. He needs to know how it applies in all these different circumstances. He has to know the concepts and the frameworks and to be able to apply it very flexibly. I don't need that. Like, my job, I'm not a tax lawyer. That's not my job. I just need to know how much money am I supposed to pay, and how do I file it the right way. And so I need training on it. So I just need to know how does it apply to me. So I don't need to know how it applies to anyone else other than me. So that's a delta between the two. When you're talking about education, someone who needs education has to be able to apply it in all these different circumstances very flexibly. Someone who needs training just needs to know how to do their own thing the right way. And so that's why I say most employees just need training. They don't need to know how to be compliance professionals. They need to know how to be compliant salespeople and compliant engineers and compliant marketers and so on and so on.
Back to you, Ronnie.
Getting back to sort of the right tool for the job. It seems to me that like, so you have, most companies do these annual compliance training, right? They do this annual compliance training. Let's touch on that for a second. It seems like, first of all, why is it an annual training? They're trying to shove too much into one bucket. Just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So I think I am somewhat sympathetic to this, right? So like, I think the form of annual training is terrible. Like it's a 100% check the box thing. That's why it's annual training. So the fact that you put annual in front of it means that you're doing it on a time-based cadence for the sake of saying you did it once a year, right? So as a format, like you're not getting a lot done there, but sometimes you have to check a box. Like that's okay. Like there are reasons you would have to do it, like for insurance or for your board, where they just want comfort out of that, right? So sometimes you have to do it. So in an ideal world, you wouldn't. It's not tied to any specific risk. It's just check the box, but you got to check a box, right? So I think the key thing when you have to check a box, and there's lots of stuff in compliance where you have to do it that way, is like you recognize that that's what you're doing and you don't overdo it. So like the problem with annual training is that people know it's a check the box thing because they have to do it once a year. And like people know that, like they pick up on like, oh, it's time to do it again. That's clearly we're checking a box. So kind of like lean into that and just do it as efficiently as possible. So I think where people go wrong with this is they overload how much stuff there is, and then it just makes it worse. So the format already is signaling to people, this is a check the box activity. If you then pile up like way too much content and like a whole bunch of learning mechanics that force people to go slow, you're going to be in this position where it looks like they're not just trying to check a box, but shift liability to employees. So the analogy here would be like, think about like if you go buy a product from Apple and you go to their website and it's like super clean, it's largely images, it's very simple, and like they're just telling you enough to get you to act. And then once you buy it, you like open up iTunes and you get the end user license agreement. It's like 40 pages. So like that's like those are different signals that that are being sent by the way that it's being communicated to you. And so if your annual training feels more like the iTunes user agreement, where it's so much information at one point, there is that as a reader, you're thinking, wow, this looks really like the iTunes user agreement, or it looks really similar to like when I rent a car and they give you that contract and you're like who's going to spend an hour reading it right there? And so the message that you get is like, well, based on other things in my life, I know that what they're signaling to me right now is it doesn't matter if I do anything. It just matters that I sign so they can hold me accountable and fire me if I do something wrong. And so when you're thinking about annual training, you may have to do it because it's check the box. Do it as fast as possible, like lean into it. If you pile all this stuff on top, then the format itself is already signaling to people it's a check the box activity. If you put too much information on people, it's going to feel more like any other time in their life where a lawyer is asking them to sign something just for legal liability and not because they actually care. I don't know that maybe Apple does, but I really think they don't care if you read any part of the iTunes EULA. I just think they care that you've checked that box. And so that's where I feel like a lot of stuff goes wrong. Is this you probably have to do it for reasons you can't control, but you can be smart about it and save your political capital for other things.
Well, so that's a great transition. So one of the reasons I wanted you to chat about that is just to lean into the idea that if there's rational reasons to have a check the box activity. So let's not pile too much effort into that, or let's do that more efficiently, call it what it is, treat it like it is, so that you can spend your time and resources doing things that are more effective. And that to me is a nice transition to basically the business that you've created, and quite frankly, the business that I've created, which is that what I think that you do is you improve ease of access to information by creating these tools that can be, I'll let you talk about it, but in my mind's eyes, so that you're providing tools for people to use in the time of need. And what we're doing is focusing on communication and awareness to improve ease of access to information about how to speak up and to spend more time on comms and awareness on more ethical kinds of issues. So anyway, speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when you talk about being efficient with a check the box thing, just briefly on that, it's your time, but it's also your political capital. So the more time you take the more time you ask of employees for annual training, the less time the business will give you for stuff that is not check the box. And so like it's very wise just to recognize that in any organization, you have a limited amount of political capital that you can spend on things. Going all in on an annual check the box training is not smart. Do that as efficiently as possible, be realistic about it, and then go figure out what's actually a little bit more risk-based. So focusing, and this is where you get into the type of work that you and I do, we're going to be zeroing in more on like, okay, who are the audiences I really care about? So I think when you and I spoke at the SEC last year, I gave this example of like the last company where I was in-house had, I don't remember, something like somewhere between 60 and like 100,000 employees, depending if you had contractors in there or not. So like a lot of people, but 500 who are director level and above. That 500 are the one you care about, like a lot. Like you care a lot about them. You care not so much about the other like giant base of those people, because the people who are at the top are the people who have the ability to like sign for stuff and like commit the company to money. And so those are the ones you want to focus your time on. You don't want to blow it all your political capital that should be being spent on those people with annual training. But so then what do you do once you do? So let's say you do that, you're efficient in annual training. What do you spend your time on? So when I talk about awareness, so we talk about training and communication, or training and education. The third pillar of that is awareness and comms. And so this is where I spend a lot of my time, where you spend a lot of your time. This is like advertise. So one way to think of this is like advertising for the stuff that you've trained and educated people on. And so it's the highest frequency stuff you're going to do. It tends to be a very light touch, but it's also a different toolkit. So I think I do want to just pause for a second and throw it back to you on the word advertising. And then I 100% will get to where I get to plug my stuff, because I know you're setting me up for that. And I'll absolutely do that. But I think if you're hearing this too, I think one of the things where I see people go wrong with awareness and comms is they just try and have it be shorter training. And I do think it's a different tool. And this is where I think the analogy of advertising is really powerful, because if you just make it a shorter version of training and education, then like it's still that tool. So, and you're trying to do something very different here that involves a lot more dealing with people's emotions and keeping things top of mind. So can you just briefly kind of frame up like, hey, these are like some of the tools to think about things like as an advertiser?
Well, so thank you for that. The thing that I like to talk about, and I agree with you on this about comms, is that it's usually a simple. You can borrow advertising techniques, which are very effective in the advertising world, which is they tend to have a very simple message. They tend to be very entertaining. They tend to try and make emotional connections with people. That doesn't necessarily mean dramatic, because like music makes emotional connections with people, and drama sometimes does, and comedy sometimes does, but they make emotional connections. And they're really there to, in some ways, and this applies to ethics and compliance, change the branding of how you think about them. And that's a big problem in ethics and compliance, is people have that title has a bad reputation. So anyway, I like to focus our stuff on how to have high touch, short, frequent, interesting communications that help change the branding about how you feel about speaking up in the ethics compliance team. And we're not trying to, and then you can dig deeper later if you're interested to get more information. And that sort of maybe tips to some of the tools that you make, which is to how to help people in the time of need. So, hey, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
So, I mean, I think how this stuff fits together is you're thinking about like a marketing funnel. So if you talk about like, there's a place for, and I think one of the areas where you see why training is bad is people keep trying to do everything at once, and nothing works that way. Like there's an advertising component, that's your awareness and communications, that is reminding people of a concept and driving them down to like something that's like, okay, what do I do now? That's where my stuff comes in often, which is the very short tactical training stuff. But like to give an analogy, like if you go look at like advertisements from the 50s for like Pall Mall cigarettes or whatever where it's just like, but what you notice is that like there's a ton of copy. There'll be like 2 or 3 paragraphs about why like drink Coca-Cola because it's great, because it's brown fizzy water. And like today, when you see how advertising is done, it's like entirely images with like a couple words. And like it's very because advertisers figured out what works, and having a ton of copy and having everything explain everything every time doesn't work for people. So I think when you're looking at the stuff you do, what I like about it is the emphasis on, okay, how do you really get people how do you make something really salient to people? And it's with the same tools advertisers use. Once that's relevant to them, what we really focus on, I guess, 2 things. So substantively, the content that Broadcat creates, we really focus on business framing. So how do business people think? Put it in their context. So the challenge with a lot of us in compliance is that we're really deep in the subject matters that we know. and it's challenging for us to translate it into like, what does the salesperson need to know? So that's what we do substantively. On the commercial side of things, so we sell that content. The way we sell it is unique too. So we are trying to change how people buy ethics and compliance comms over at compliancedesignclub.com. That's our site for that. So right now, especially if you're listening to this and you've been in compliance a little bit, how you tend to have to buy things is you end up buying like way more than you'll ever use in your entire lifetime. You have to pay for it forever because you never get to own it. And so what we are trying to do with Compliance Design Club is when you join as a member, you get hundreds and hundreds of options. You only pay for what you actually use. The stuff you buy, you get to keep forever, and you get something free each month as well. So totally different than anything else in compliance, totally similar to everything else in your like other life. So we're trying to make it feel very, very much like a normal consumer product. That is a lot more customer friendly. So if you're listening to this and you're hearing from your business that they want you to be, they want to see that you can be flexible and cost efficient, come check us out over there. Our site is compliancedesignclub.com.
That's awesome. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah. So, Ricardo, I heard you ask 3 questions. What am I trying to do? How do I measure it? And what's the best tool to accomplish that? Could you expand a little bit on how do you measure it? Because that's what the government has really focused on largely since 2017, but they call it effectiveness. How do you measure effectiveness?
Yeah, so monitoring is the answer. And so this is where I think part of our approach is to recognize that training is, like, you don't measure training like in a silo, you measure it in conjunction with other parts of your program. So training should tie directly to something you are monitoring, whether that's a control or whether that's an operational indicator. And so that's with our work, we focus a lot on the type of things that's like, this is the type of data point you'd be monitoring, and this is how you train someone to do that the right way. And then the way you know if it's working is if your monitoring data gets better. And so when I hear people ask questions about how you'll know if your program's working, I usually find that that's a sign that they're not doing much, if any, compliance monitoring. Like that's how you know. Like it's an element of your program is that you are monitoring the operational outputs and you've defined what it means for that to happen the right way. So it's this process of, if you're worried about corruption, for example, why? The reason is because your business must do something. There must be some type of operations or behaviors that your people engage in or could engage in that makes you worried about it. And so how does that translate into something you can capture? And so that might be something like, hey, we're worried because we have a high-touch sales process that touches government officials because we're in construction or whatever. We're worried about gifts and entertainment, but we operate in a part of the world where you can't just say no, you do have to do them. So how might you capture that and monitor it? Well, you can capture and monitor what people submit for reimbursement. And so you start so the idea is, and then you can train people on, this is the requirement for what you're allowed to do. So that I think it's working backwards from, risk assessment through monitoring and controls and then training. I think the reason why a lot of people struggle to measure training is they do it first. It's actually downstream from monitoring. And so once you understand what outcomes you're looking for in your program, then you train to achieve those outcomes. Just the process of giving people information so you drive towards outcomes you want. I think a lot of times people start with training because it just feels like, okay, well, I don't really have to understand what my business does to go tell people about the FCPA. The problem is if someone then asks you, how do you know if your training works? You don't really have an answer. So when I answer that question, it would be in the context of training should tie very closely to monitoring. That reflects a very integrated approach to not just like the compliance elements being integrated together, but then being integrated with what the business practically does, which is just the basic core of operationalization.
Ronnie?
Yeah, well, so I've had the pleasure of being on panels with Ricardo, and I know that he and I could talk about this forever. But in the interest of time, let me try and summarize, and we'll wrap up. So what I'm taking away from this, compliance people often are spending their time trying to educate people and focusing on doing this in a very sophisticated way.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Creativity and Compliance. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a review.
Focus on training on specific things that will help people do their jobs better, and then have maybe spend some of that extra time on improving ease of access to information. comms and awareness, reminding people, making it easy to know where information is, and giving them tools, i.e. like what Broadcast does, to help them do their jobs better. Do you want to put a button on that and then give yourself a final plug, Ricardo?
Look, compliance is like any other part of running a business. I think the more you frame it as part of business ops versus legal, the easier it is to understand why it's so important to do it the way you just described, and also why it's hard to do it that way. It is very easy. It is easy, or it's easier, I'll say, to go and tell people about what the law says or what a risk is. But if you feel that persistent unease that you're not really sure how to show if your stuff works, like that's why. Because it's not really tied to business ops. So, recognizing there's going to be times you have to check a box, being okay with that, and then spending the rest of your time really figuring out what do I want the business to be doing, and then training them on how to do that. Like that is where you will get the most business partnership, where the business is going to see the value the most, and where you're going to have the best data that you can show as to whether your stuff works or not. And what really does is help you recognize that, again, training and comms are tools. They're tools to achieve some type of business outcome by themselves. Just doing them is a cost. So you use them to achieve a purpose. So we've got tons more resources. If like expanding on this, we have a free book you can download that walks through all of this approach over at thebroadcat.com. And you can check out our product site over at compliancedesignClub.com.
So, Ricardo, you've now been on 2 of 28 podcasts. Awesome. I have. So you only have 20 more to go. This has been great.
That's so many. Oh my gosh.
So, and we haven't even gotten to the non-Tom Fox podcast.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So, this is very cool and lots to think about, lots to digest. And I think, or rather, I hope we can continue the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Creativity and Compliance. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to subscribe and leave a review.